So Brian, I guess my point there was, I wanted to make sure you realize that that's not uncommon. Like, just because we've done Out of the Matrix or whatever, that kind of stuff can still be upsetting.
Sure.
Since we just started the video, we're talking about the idea that, it bothers us when other people are upset with us. And I think, as Mary Lou was saying that for some of us, it's the other end of the spectrum. We struggle more with being upset with other people. Some people struggle more with people being upset with them. I want to say that's more of a blue thing. Like, blue people tend to be more sensitive to other people being upset with them. At least that certainly is my experience. I've gotten a lot of practice with people being upset with me with my students. I got a kid right now who's spent 2 years doing very little academics, and he's starting to get angry at me and blame me for all of this. And I told his mom where he stood, and he came back, "Why'd you tell my mom this? And why'd you tell my mom that?" Blah, blah, blah. And I find myself getting, variably upset, not near as much as I have in the past. In the past, I would have literally lost sleep over that. So I don't have that kind of concern about it, but I certainly find that it still bothers me to some extent. So, yeah.
It seems to me pretty normal to have some kind of reaction.
Yeah, I would agree. Yep.
In order to be totally immune to any kind of reaction, then you will have had to have done a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the way if you had done enough work that it didn't upset you, the thing is that you would still acknowledge that something's happening. In other words, this person's saying something to me and addressing me with something. And what I've been talking to some clients recently about is this idea of parsing out between what's projection of guilt and what's something that I genuinely need to look at. In other words, if someone says something to me and it's upsetting me and upsetting to me, and maybe it's about me, I have to decide, is this just projection of guilt? And is there any information in here that I need to look at? In other words, if they tell me that I'm inconsiderate, is there any truth behind that? Is there something that I need to look, even if it doesn't upset me emotionally, it's okay for me to listen to that feedback and decide, is there something there for me to address? But that's hard to do when you're emotionally bothered by what they said. It's easier to parse that out when you're not. The less, I think, the less emotionally upset you are about it, the easier it is to parse out what's the projection of guilt and what's something that I genuinely need to look at. Does that make sense?
Yes.
For sure.
So Brian, why you said that it doesn't upset you as much as it used to? Why do you think that is?
I mean, probably just because of all the inner work I've gone through, and also just expanded awareness, like what Mary was saying. Just this idea that, like, it's recognizing that, well, I kind of lost track what I was going to say there.
Happens to me all the time.
It's just being aware that, like, that other people are going through what they're going through, and they might be just like for example, the way that I might get angry with somebody else. I mean, just like what you're saying, is that projection? I mean, because it all boils down to me to some degree. It's like the experience is rising from within, no matter what's going on around me. So
yeah.
So it's like, I guess just being more emotionally mature also, just because of everything that I've done. So
yeah.
So all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and it really leads in nicely to the topic tonight, because you remember the topic that I sent out was about guilt, okay, and the behavior cycle section, which is essentially what we talk about in Out of the Matrix as the projection of guilt. Okay, so we're going to leave this off. Bruce, why don't you give your definitions of guilt versus shame?
Well, in my view, guilt is not a feeling or an emotion. Guilt is a perception. And the feeling that is linked to the perception that I'm guilty is shame.
Yeah.
So when we talk about feeling guilty, I think that that's a deflection. It's a subconscious means of not connecting with the actual feeling of shame.
Does that make sense to everybody?
My theory.
And that runs along this idea of I'm going to share my screen with you guys. That runs along the idea of this idea that guilt is that I've done something wrong. Shame is that I am something wrong. So Bruce, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, Bruce's definition is sort of along those lines in the sense that he's saying that guilt is a perception. In other words, I've done something wrong, versus shame being about, I feel like I am wrong. Similar, Bruce?
Well, similar, yeah, that was Greg Lieber's thing. He loved that. It's a nice metaphor. I don't think it says exactly what I say, but I don't know which is more accurate.
Yeah. So just to review real quickly, in our behavior cycle section, we talk about being outer directed by a perceived misbehavior. So in other words, we perceive someone else or something else as misbehaving, and then we become outer directed. We blame it for our upset. We blame the person, the event, the thing for our upset. That's being outer directed. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And then we want to punish them, right? You hurt me, so I'll hurt you. And this is the opposite of what we were just talking about. We were just talking about, I start to recognize that someone's projecting their stuff onto me. I start to understand what's exactly going on. I'm projecting my stuff, they're projecting their stuff. And so, I see it as projection rather than taking it personally. And that's a huge difference. That's a giant step to be able to make, to go from taking someone's behavior or an event and taking it personally to instead going to, I see this as a projection of their pain or their difficulty, or a projection of my pain or my difficulty. And that's what's occurring here. And when I perceive it that way, I can see things very differently than when I see it as a personal attack on me. Does that make sense? And that's, I think, one of the shifts that you're referring to, Brian, that occurs when you start to understand this material. You start to really get an idea of what's really happening, which is the projection of guilt. And I guess, Bruce, what you would say, what you would call more accurate, is you would say it was projection of shame.
Well, yeah. I think it would still be a projection of guilt. That's the guilt being a perception or a belief. I believe that I'm guilty, and that's intolerable to my subconscious. So I throw it out there.
Yeah. So when people are projecting at us, tell me some of the methods that you guys use internally in your thinking that helps you deal with people who are projecting their stuff onto you. Brian sort of, I don't know if it was Brian or Mary Lou, sort of mentioned this idea that one of the things we recognize is that it's going on, something's being projected at me, and it's coming from them, and it's coming from their pain or difficulty. So that's one way to kind of mitigate the upset for me. In other words, I recognize something's going on for them, but that can also be denial, right? In other words, I could make it all about that person's, oh, this is just their pain. They're just projecting their pain. I have nothing to look at. And that's why I throw that caveat in there. There might be something that you need to look at in this exchange. Doesn't mean you need to feel bad or guilty about it, but you might need to look at what's going on for you. And we can't default to the idea that this is just a projection of someone else's pain, so there's nothing for me to do with it, because that to me can be denial.
In order to really do that, you have to be clear on your own innocence. Because if part of you shares that same belief, then an attempt to say, well, they're just projecting, is, at least in some part, denial.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of those things that if people don't have a full understanding of what we're teaching, this is one of the things that they can do with it. And it's something my students used to do. They would say, oh, well, based on what you're teaching me, then my parents, whenever they get upset, that's their fault. That's on them. So I don't need to do anything. And I don't need to change my behavior. I don't need to show up differently. There's nothing then for me to look at. This is all their problem. And that's what we're talking about. That's sort of using what we teach for denial.
Right, everything, there's nothing that we teach that can't be weaponized.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely right. Yep. And what part of ourselves is weaponizing?
What part of it? Well, our ego.
Ego.
Yeah, the ego. Ego is weaponizing it. And that's my experience with the ego being so sophisticated and so tricky that it takes perfectly good information and uses it as a weapon. It weaponizes it. We use it to make ourselves feel bad. We use it to make other people feel bad. We use it for denial. We use it to avoid, not take responsibility. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. And so you got to be careful about this process and what you do with it. And so that you're not taking almost like a higher than thou sort of attitude, like, well, I don't let things bother me. So whatever you're saying is just your problem and you need to deal with it.
What about recognizing that it's a call for love?
Yeah. That's a phenomenal comment and a phenomenal idea. And we do need to do that, recognize that. But again, we still have to be careful that we can use that as a method for denial, right? Like, oh, that poor person, they're just in pain. I'm just going to extend love to them because it's not about me. It has nothing to do with me. And again, we just have to be careful that we're taking a look at what's going on for us. Like, is there something in this exchange that I need to look at? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Everything can be weaponized. Yeah.
So, but generally speaking, Mary Lou, my experience with extending love is that I feel like that for my experience personally, when I recognize that, I think, and again, I could be in denial, that it's generally pretty genuine on my part, but again, I'm in my own head, so who knows what the hell's going on in there.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah, go ahead, Neville.
Yeah, hey, actually, I had a situation yesterday. I'll just bring it up. I was doing lawns at one of my clients' house, and there's a lady next door. She's doesn't like the noise, and actually, I was talking to the client earlier today, saying, yeah, she gives you any problems, let us know. Well, anyway, so I was working, and she came out, elderly woman. She came out of her backyard, came over to me, kind of really angry, obviously, and she says, "I'm going to be in a Zoom meeting in 15 minutes. Are you going to be done by then?" And I honestly did get defensive. I felt like, I kind of knew it was coming, but, it's just like, oh, she I felt like the attack. But, as I thought about it more, something kind of shifted me. It says, well, she's not attacking me. It just has nothing to do with me. If this equipment I'm using was quiet, it would be a non-issue. Okay, so it's not about me. And once I got to that point, I started realizing it had nothing to do with me, but she was reacting to what the sound, the noise. Things kind of shifted for me. I kind of like, oh, okay, it has nothing to do with me. And I kind of shifted more to like empathy, but not like sympathy or anything, but more like understanding where she was coming from. And I wasn't making her wrong for it. I said, yeah, I wish these things weren't so loud either. It was kind of where I was thinking. So it was just kind of an interesting shift. So I kind of came to a place of, I guess, natural forgiveness around it. But I stopped, going, oh, that old bitch, whatever. I was just like, I got it. I got it. It has nothing to do with me, and she's, and I've seen her health failing over the years when I see her. So I think she's got some anger on board. She doesn't know how to do it. I started thinking, there's a lot of old people out here that, unfortunately, things don't work well for them in their life and they become angry. And here I'm seeing an example of that, somebody who's maybe I started maybe making my own story about, things that may have not gone in her life. Yeah, but I started feeling more like empathy, more compassionate, I guess.
Well,
and it shifted it for me.
Yeah. So what thought in your head began the shift, Neville? So you said you were.
It wasn't about me. It wasn't me. It wasn't her attack. Wasn't that my perceived attack wasn't against me personally. It wasn't against Neville. It was her peace was being disturbed. If I was there just walking around, it would have been no issue. But it had nothing to do with me, and it wasn't about me, period. And that was the biggest shift I had, was that it's not me.
Yeah, and that's a huge shift. This idea that I'm not taking it personally. This isn't a personal attack. Okay, and so
right.
What Neville's describing is a phenomenal shift in the sense that you take this idea, you take this thought, this isn't a personal attack, and then you can approach it all very differently. Whereas if you see it as a personal attack, you're taking the attack personally. In other words, this is an affront to me as a person. then you're going to have a very different experience than what you just described. It's very hard to get to
Absolutely.
the place of understanding where they're coming from and what's going on for them if you're taking it as a personal attack. So this is really one of the first steps in this process that we're talking about with the projection of guilt, behavior cycle, some of those kinds of things. And what we talk about is not taking things personally. It's not a
Yes,
personal
so that-
attack. It's generally something going on for them. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah,
That speaks well of your level of guilt. Neville.
and my level of guilt.
Yeah, because I mean, if you were carrying around more guilt, you wouldn't have gone there.
Yeah,
You
Yep.
would have just gotten pissed. So now the humanitarian thing to do is to gift this woman with some noise canceling headphones. for the next Zoom meeting.
well,
Yeah,
I was mindful of, I was mindful of her request after that, so I was being mindful I started to do my job, but I was trying to do it as mindful as possible, trying to, so I mean, yeah, but you're right, eventually, but, so anyway, so,
Yeah, so thank you for saying that, Bruce. As we often do, we put things on a continuum 1 to 10, and Bruce's a very cogent comment there, the idea that Neville's ability to not take it personally is an indication of how much guilt he's carrying around. And so I think that's a great idea, sort of a jumping off point to talk about this idea that, our defensiveness in experiences is directly proportional to how much guilt we're carrying around in general. And so, what the question is, what are we carrying guilt around about? So what's our guilt about?
But we have existential guilt.
Yeah, I mean, we can go really deep and go into the spiritual existential guilt for, leaving God, that whole Course in Miracles kind of a thing. So that's certainly a base thing. Oops, sorry. Somebody calling back about my daughter's car, but I'll get back to him. But on a more practical level, if we're not talking to somebody who's a Course in Miracles student, what other things do we feel guilty about, or carry guilt around about?
Could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, past behavior,
yeah, it's a good one.
what else could we be carrying guilt about? Our personal appearance.
Mhm.
Any,
Bruce says-
any,
Go ahead.
Our status or stature in society,
any
maybe,
perceived failure.
yeah,
What's that?
Any perceived failure of ours.
Yeah, our family. Our job. I mean, as Bruce says, there's just an exponential list we could come up with about things that we generally feel guilty about. But then we're not going to the Course in Miracles level, but if we go to the out of the matrix level, what's the core thing that we feel guilt about?
I would like not being good enough, or
Yeah, the belief, whatever the belief is.
Yeah.
Okay, and these things play into each other, right? In terms of, we put the belief on a 1 to 10 scale, and if our not good enough belief is an 8, not good enough, NGE, not good enough. If that's our level of false belief, it's an 8, then all of this stuff is going to be hard to get away from. My status, my family, my job, all of those things, I'm going to use all those outer directed things to judge myself. Okay. Whereas if my not good enough is a 2, then these things aren't going to have as big a play in my mind. And this is why we work on reducing the number of our false belief. Okay. Because that affects everything else. The belief that we have about ourselves, how we think about ourselves, affects our life in every possible way. And so what we're saying to Neville in this experience with this woman next door with the noise is that his guilt, in other words, he's lowered the number of his belief. And so he was able to kind of see things without taking it personally and seeing it as a personal attack. But it's the belief in the out of the matrix vernacular, it's the belief that we work on reducing. Because again, trying to manage all this stuff in our life so that we can feel okay about ourselves is quite honestly an impossible task. And that's generally what the ego wants you to do because it realizes you will not be able to do it. Whereas we go after this core belief and reduce that, and I've just witnessed that over and over again working for people. they get in touch with the belief. So can you guys give me the process of how we do that? How do we reduce the number of our belief? What's one of the first things we do?
We bring them to the surface and we look at them and we realize that they're not true.
Yeah, and so the reason this is such an effective process from the ego's point of view is not good enough exists in our this is subconscious down here, this is conscious up here. Remember, this is 90% and this is 10%, generously speaking, okay? And so not good enough down here exists in our subconscious mind. And one of the reasons the system works so well is because it's subconscious, it's out of our awareness. It runs our show and we don't even realize it's running our show. So what do we need to do? We need to bring it up into conscious awareness. And when we bring it up into conscious awareness, as Mary Lou says, then we can start to let it go. We can see the lack of reality in it. Because, and there's different comments we can make about that, like this idea that not good enough or not worthy or not lovable has no concrete reality to it. It doesn't exist as a thing. It's simply a thought or an idea. And as a thought or an idea, it's malleable, it can be changed. It's not like a rock or a car or some solid material that takes a lot of physical energy to change. This is a thought or an idea. And not that it doesn't take energy to change it, but it's very malleable, that thought. Okay. But again, we can't process that until we bring it up into conscious awareness. So, and Brian and some other people sort of mentioned this. When someone is upset with us, we got to be taking that as a personal attack. Because remember, I say all the time, you can't be upset about something unless you think it means something about you. You can't be upset about something unless you think it means something about you. Otherwise, why would you be upset? That's why the old, if I called you a yellow Volkswagen idea, no one gets upset by that because they realize there's no truth in that. If someone calls you an idiot and that resonates with you, you're gonna get upset by that. So that's one of the ways to look at what you were talking about, Brian, is that when someone's upset with you, you're taking it as a personal attack. And the indication is because you said you don't get as upset as you used to, that your guilt level has gone down, meaning your belief number has gone down as well. And I don't know about for you guys, and you guys can speak to this each personally, but my experience is that when we're working to reduce those beliefs, it's not, although we describe some conscious processes with that, and I'll get into one of those in a minute, generally speaking, it's just the awareness of it that allows it to reduce. In other words, I really believe that it has a certain size, let's just say in our subconscious mind, a certain level on that continuum. And as soon as we bring it to the consciousness, I think that number starts to go down, as long as we can deal with it on a conscious level. Does that make sense? Because Brian, I don't think that you spend hours and hours and hours working on your beliefs. Maybe I'm wrong.
I probably have actually at this point.
Okay. All right, fair. But and I guess, so you tell me what's that look like when you've worked on your beliefs?
Usually it involves, well, I don't do it in the moment. Usually what'll happen is I'll replay the events and I'll allow myself to have the emotions again. And then I will consciously just let that arise as much as I can. And then just, sometimes I have help with this. There's people I work with, if it's like heavy emotional stuff. And yeah, you just sort of let it move through you as best you can. Sometimes it really sucks, but and then yeah, when you come out the other side of that, you kind of realize, wow, and then you sort of test yourself and you go, you replay the event again, or you do something like that, and then you sort of test to see if there's still more to process there, or if you actually got rid of quite a bit of it, like let it be free or whatever it is. It sort of just transmutes itself.
Yeah. So you're saying if I still have emotional charge around it, the level of emotion or charge tells me how much work I still need to do.
Yeah, I think that's mostly probably true. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like the process you're describing is more of a releasing the emotion rather than focusing on the belief. Am I right?
Yeah, I guess it's less of an intellectual thing. It's more of, feeling it out. And then you sort of, well, in my experience, it's sort of, shifts, like, because the emotions have been released and processed, it sort of shifts how, like, somehow it shifts like the way that you're actually behaving, the way that you were thinking about yourself. And then when you have a moment similar to what you went through where you had a really bad emotional charge, and then then you realize, like, wow, I've actually come a lot farther than I thought, because I'm like not really being triggered anymore by something that would have super triggered me a long time ago. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear how other people sort of I mean, I know there's other ways to do it, like writing things down, that kind of stuff, that can be helpful too, obviously.
Yeah, but I really like what you just
Well-
described. So I want to talk about, before we jump on to some other people, I want to just talk about what Brian just described. So we're talking about making it conscious, so it's conscious thought. But I also think Brian's touching on something that's important, which is we need to touch into the emotional aspect of this. In other words, we need to, because I think this belief existing in our subconscious mind carries a lot of emotion in us. And so when we bring it into consciousness, we can look at the emotional charge that we have around it. And as Brian said, we can let go of some of the emotion that we have around it. So I think that's part of the process that we're describing. Mary Lou, you were going to say?
Well, yeah, I was going to say another thing that's helpful is for me, and we do this in Out of the Matrix too, is go to the opposite of that belief and find proof of how that belief is not true. Like
Very
if, you don't feel lovable, to find, people around you that of course love you.
Yeah, evidence of the opposite, right? So we can look, so that's one of the ways that when we get consciously aware of the belief, we can look at evidence of the opposite. In other words, if I feel not good enough, I can look at the evidence that I am good enough, that I have people that love me, all those kind of evidentiary kind of things. And despite the fact that that might seem a little outer directed, if that's what we need to do, that's what we need to do, okay? It's just one of the ways that so the emotional piece, the conscious awareness piece, and the most powerful method that I'm aware of is the method that I often describe, where I get in touch with the various triggers for this belief. And this is why we do our How You Do It worksheet. Okay, I get in touch with the fact that I have a not good enough belief. Okay, I just got in touch with that on Saturday night and the weekend. And what's that look like? Well, I know that I experienced that when I talked to my mom. I know that triggers my not good enough belief. So she's one of my triggers for that. And so what I try and do is, the next time I'm speaking with my mom, I want to be consciously aware of the fact that belief gets triggered when I'm talking to her. Whereas in the past, I blamed her comments, her words, the way she's showing up for my upset. I say to myself in that moment, no, I'm upset because I have a not good enough belief, and that's what's being triggered in this moment. And that's a real powerful conscious process where you're literally rewiring your brain. And this is the description we do in the weekend. The videos that we show from What the Bleep Down the Rabbit Hole is this idea that when my mom triggers me and I'm upset and I'm blaming my mom, that's an outer directed view, OD, outer directed view, and that is getting wired into my brain every time it happens, that's what's going on, that mom is to blame. So when instead I get in touch with not good enough, and then I go to see my mom and I acknowledge, no, this isn't my mom that I'm upset with. I'm upset because I have a not good enough belief. You're literally rewiring your brain in that moment from being outer directed to being inner directed. You're owning your responsibility for how you feel in the moment. And this goes on two levels. One is, we talk about owning your feelings being inner directed, but we're also talking about owning your feelings, being responsible for your feelings, owning that responsibility through this process of recognizing your false belief. So that's a lot of information. Does that make sense or raise any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
You kind of started walking something back when
Talk to me.
when the idea of collecting different evidence came up.
Mm-hmm.
You pointed out that it was like outer directed,
Right.
but that's irrelevant because as you just said about your mother, we spent our lifetimes collecting outer directed evidence to make those beliefs true.
Yeah.
So it's completely appropriate to find different outer directed evidence.
Yeah. 100%. That's one of the reasons I said that. And as a piece of clarification, it is outer directed, but I think it's probably a necessary step to go through. It'd be wonderful if we could all stand there and say, what happens outside of me doesn't affect me, but the fact of the matter is we live as humans, and that's just not the truth. So
Yeah, I'd say the fact that that evidence is outer directed is completely irrelevant.
yeah, well, I mean, it is outer directed, but whether it's relevant or not, I don't know. I mean, it could become relevant as you work through this process, and you might decide it might help you at some point to recognize not all this evidence, because this is where A Course in Miracles would eventually take us. So the process is we recognize what's happening. Maybe we use the evidence to look for the opposite, but at some point we start to feel so good about ourselves. This is the hope, that all of that doesn't matter, that I become interdirected enough that, what's going on outside of me literally has very little effect on what's going on for how I feel about myself.
Right,
So I
but
think it's
that-
relevant to recognize that it's outer directed if you're shooting for that sort of Course in Miracles type recognition of who you really are.
Yeah, that's going up another level. though.
Yeah, absolutely it is. But I just think it's valuable to recognize. I think it's valuable at this point to say, yes, it's good to look for the evidence, but know that that is an outer directed process. But there's nothing wrong with that. And I like your explanation. Your explanation is good. That we've gathered evidence for the truth of this our whole lives. Now we're going to gather evidence for the opposite. So nothing wrong with that. It absolutely is appropriate. It needs to be done, but it's a step in a process.
Yeah.
At some point, hopefully, I'll hopefully feel good enough about myself that I won't need as much evidence, external evidence of my goodness as I did in the past, because the level of the false belief is going down. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Got a thumbs up from Brian. Neville, you're good? I'm gonna
Yes.
assume you're good, Neville. We didn't lose you, did we, Neville?
No, I was muted.
Oh, okay, good. So in behavior cycles, I want to go to a different behavior cycles now. So let me pull that up real quick. Share screen. So if we go down to our awareness behavior cycle piece here, this is really valuable to look at. So the earlier ones were, you can see 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A, and 6A. I want them, 4As, I want them to hurt more than I do. They want me to hurt more than they do. What we sort of described as we started this conversation, when Neville was having that exchange with the neighbor, he was at 1B. He was understanding this behavior. He was understanding this lady was going through some hurt. She was going through something. And so with that understanding, his response could break the cycle of our understanding makes us responsible, able to respond, to behave differently. So that's exactly what Neville described. He understood what we've taught. He understood what he's been learning. He was able to use that in this exchange with this woman, get that she was sort of projecting some stuff that was going on for her, and he handled it totally differently based on that understanding. That's one of the reasons we teach this section, is so that we can understand what's going on for other people and we can respond differently. And again, my students have been a great exercise for me with this. I've been able to exercise this muscle and practice this a lot. And I got to say, the kid today, I described that student earlier who hasn't been doing work for 2 years and is getting on my case. Why did I tell his mom that kind of stuff? I definitely felt some defensiveness and had to take some deep breaths and back off and not say anything, even though part of me wanted to, point out some of the stuff that was going on for him. So, it certainly raised my blood pressure a little bit as that was going on. So I'm not immune to that kind of stuff either. So what are the possibilities if I really understood that the other person was hurting like I do? How might I respond? And again, Neville's description of that exchange that's a great description of how you can respond totally differently than the world tells you have to, because the world tells us we have to react like 1A, 4A, 2A, 5A, 3A, and 6A. That's the world would say, most people, if you describe to them that you're being personally attacked, they would say you need to attack back or get defensive or defend yourself. But again, based on what we're teaching, we get what's going on for folks and we can choose to behave differently. one of the beautiful things in terms of what we teach. So other questions about any of that? Projection of guilt. So, that's where we go back to what are we projecting? Of course, I'm sorry, out of the matrix, we're projecting our beliefs out. And we're projecting the associated guilt that we have about those beliefs that we have. In other words, I feel not good enough. And depending on the level of that not good enough belief, I'm going to project, my projection of guilt is going to correspond with the level of the misbelief in my mind. And again, we go back to, that's why we work to make the belief more conscious so that we can let it go. That number goes down, we project less guilt, we understand what's going on for other people. Now, I want to go back and just cover again what we said earlier, which is it's very hard to understand what's going on for other people when our false belief is really high. In other words, when our false belief is really a high number, then when someone projects onto us, we're going to feel like we need to defend ourselves. And we're going to project back, we're going to get upset, we're going to take it personally. So this is one of the key things is we have to reduce the number of the belief in our mind so that we can handle the situation and do what Neville did. And that's why Bruce's comment was so astute about the fact that Neville's level of guilt must be relatively low for him to be able to handle that situation and not get upset with that woman. So that's sort of an encapsulation of what we talked about. Does that kind of cover everything that we covered tonight? Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
And I don't know, do other people have other experiences like Neville?
I mean, yeah, like all the time, but it just depends on, like, it depends on the circumstance. Like that's how, like you talk about, you're gonna have a different reaction to the grocery store clerk than your mom or something like that. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I have that experience all the time where somebody's agitated around me or something like that. And I just like, I don't, it doesn't bother me. I just go, I recognize they're just probably not having a good day or whatever.
Yeah. So Brian brings up a good point. Why can we, with the grocery store clerk, let it go more easily than with mom?
You have a lot more history with your mom than with the grocery store clerk.
Yeah, you got a lot
Sure
more.
that.
And emotional attachment also.
Yeah, there's a lot of story and history.
Yeah.
Neural nets.
Yeah.
Neural nets.
Yeah, a lot of triggers and old beliefs all wrapped up in one.
Yeah, emotional attachment. And then also, it's much more likely that we will see our mom as a representative of ourselves
True that.
than a grocery store clerk. In other words, my mom's behavior, I'm much more likely to see that as a representation of who I am as a person. Just like parents are much more likely to see their kids' behavior as a representation of who they are than the neighbor's kids.
Oh, for sure.
Right. It's an extension of them.
Yeah, it's sort of an extension. So, that's why we do our circles and we say, as we practice this process, it's easiest with the grocery store clerk out here, the grocery clerk, and then, maybe some distant friends, and then maybe some closer friends, and then maybe some distant relatives, distant relatives, then some closer relatives, then our immediate family, and then we're the little dot right in the middle. We're the toughest ones to do that with ourselves. But once you've gotten to the point, once you've worked through all these various levels and get into that dot, you've had a lot of practice with all these other folks. It will presumably make it a lot easier to work on that dot that is you in the middle. But that is the toughest challenge, is letting go of, projecting onto ourselves. So how is it that we can project onto ourselves? How is that possible?
Because ourselves
Crickets.
aren't really us.
Say again, Bruce?
Ourselves are not who we are.
Yeah.
They're a
So
separate entity.
Yeah.
yeah, so we're sort of projecting onto our behavior and the way we show up in the world rather than who we really are. So in other words, when we assess that I am this kind of person based on the way I show up in the world, I'm creating a story about who I am rather than, one of the things they talk about being in the moment. When you're in the moment, you can let go of your history and you can be anything you want. So I used to say this in a lot of weekends, if I could take a baseball bat and whack everybody on the head and give them amnesia, then that would open them up to all kinds of new different ways of showing up in the world. We get bought in, and we even have, the brain wiring that we have ties us into a certain perception of ourselves. And it's really just a projection. It's a projection from our past. We create this understanding of who we think we are, and we live that out in the moment based on our past. So we're projecting our past understanding of ourselves into the current moment. If we could let go of all that past stuff, then again, we could be open to anything in the moment. So that's one of the ways that we project onto ourselves, is by bringing the past into the present moment. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yep.
We could probably spend another hour talking about how we project onto ourselves. That's one of the ways we do it. All right, folks, that's what I have for tonight. Any last minute questions or comments?
Oh, hey, Chris, I did find the video, so thank you for the, I
Okay,
did get your email.
you did. Okay, good.
Yeah, we're
You're
okay.
getting like 15 or 20 views a week, so that's good. That means we've got some people who are interested and just can't join us on Thursday night, so that's great. So I'll do that with this one as well. And then Brian's obviously not joining us. Mary Lou isn't joining us. Neville and Bruce, you guys are both coming to the,
Yeah, and Leslie is too.
okay, cool. And you and Leslie are debating what you're gonna bring?
I thought she was kind of handling that. You haven't heard back from her yet.
I think I've only heard from Bruce and Cheryl.
Renee.
Cheryl
Okay,
Kaufman.
I'll talk with her this evening.
Yeah, I mean,
Is there a list now of, I guess there, I'll look at my old emails.
yeah, I sent out an email. I sent out-
Leslie responded.
Yeah, I sent out an email requesting stuff. What's that, Bruce?
Yeah,
I saw Leslie responded and Renee responded.
Not